Hello everyone, welcome to this fifth section of SCSS tutorial. In this video, we will see how SCSS mixin works, and then we will see @include to include these mixins. The sass @mixin directive let us create a CSS code that can be reused. So let's see how. We can define a mixin with @mixin directive. What is the syntax? Syntax is here. So this is the CSS mixin syntax. We just need to add @mixin and then the name of the mixin, and inside the mixin block we can define our CSS with the property and value. So let's see the example. If there are some common CSS to be reused in our application, we can define inside this mixin. So this is how we can define the mixin. In the next slide we will see how we can use these mixins. So the @include directive is created to let us use our mixins. So the mixin that we have created in the previous slide, we can see in this slide how we can use it. So this is the sass include syntax. There is a CSS selector, and then we just need to write @include and the mixin name to include the mixin. So a mixin can also include other mixins. So here I have defined a mixin @mixin label, and then we have defined some CSS properties. So here I have just created a three different CSS selector. So these are some common CSS that we have defined in our mixin. So in all of these three CSS selector, I have included the same mixin, my mixin label, and then if I need to override any CSS property, or we want to add any additional CSS property, then we can also define inside my selector. So instead of defining these CSS inside each of these blocks, I have created a mixin which is common to all of these three selectors. Then I have included this mixin, so we do not need to define separately for each of the selector. So let's see some more details about sass mixin. So we can also pass variable to our mixins. So let's see how. So here, while defining my mixin, we have taken a parameter, let's say mixin font size, and then instead of my hard-coded font size, I am assigning this variable to this font size. So at the time of including this mixin, so we need to just pass the parameter value. So let's say 2 rem. So in this case my font size will be 2 rem. So if in another CSS selector I can include the same mixin where let's say our font size is required 1 rem, then we can pass here 1 rem. Next thing is the default value for the mixin. It is also possible to define default value for our mixin variable. So here I have also defined my mixin font size default value, which is 1.2 rem. So if there is a CSS selector which includes this mixin label and does not provide the parameter value, then the default will be a 1.2 rem. So if I pass here 2 rem, then the font size will be 2 rem. If I do not pass any value, then the font size will be 1.2 rem. So let's start with the hands-on exercise on sass mixin. To understand our mixin, we have just created three different labels. So and then we have assigned a class to each of these variables. So let's say my mixin heading, mixin subheading, and then the mixin paragraph. So now I am going to create a mixin. Common CSS that will be applied to all these three labels will put inside my mixin. So in my mixin we have added these properties which are common to all these three labels. Then I'm going to create three different classes for each of the labels. So let's say for my mixin heading, we are just going to include this mixin. I need any additional properties apart from the mixins, then we can define inside my mixin heading block, or we can also override any of the properties from the mixin as well. So let's say we also have a font size in my mixin, so it will be, let's say, 1.2 rem. So my mixin heading, in my mixin heading we are overriding the font size to a 2 rem. So now I am going to write CSS for my mixin subheading. In the same way, we are going to include my Mixin label and then overriding the font size in this case to 1.8 rem. And same for my Mixin para, and Mixin para I am going to include my Mixin label. So in this case of Mixin para, I do not need to override the font size. Let's say it will be a 1.2 rem. So if I need to add any additional properties apart from the Mixin, then we call also define here. So in my Mixin para, I am adding a properties. If I hover on this Mixin para, then the color will become green. So let's see the output. If I hover on this, then the color will become green. So in this way, we can define our common CSS property in my Mixin, and then wherever in the CSS selector we need the same properties, we can include this Mixin. Let's understand Mixin parameter. So we can also define a parameter in my Mixin. So here in my Mixin label, I am defining a parameter Mixin font size. So instead of hardcoding font size, I am assigning the font size to this parameter. So at the time of including the Mixin, we can pass this parameter value. So here in my main heading, we are passing the value of font size 2 rem. In my subheading, we are passing the font size 1.8 rem. And in my Mixin para, we are passing the value 1.2 rem. So now it is applied. It is 2 rem, 1.8 rem and 1.2 rem. So here, instead of assigning a hardcode font size value, we are passing the parameter through a Mixin. So we can also define the default value to our parameter. So in the Mixin font size, here we have defined the default value to 1.2 rem. So if anyone include this Mixin and do not pass the value of this parameter, then the value of this parameter will be 1.2 rem. So in this case, in my Mixin para, we need a font size of 1.2 rem, so we do not need to pass the value of parameter, since the default value of the parameter is 1.2 rem. So in this exercise we have seen how Sass @Mixin and @include works.